let's look at the various dimensions along which disagreement might occur. We said they've got the same evidence, and we're thinking of this as some sort of database of facts. Okay. The question is, what are they making of this evidence? And one way they might disagree is by attaching different weight to different bits of evidence. So let's switch examples to see this, and we'll talk about two detectives who are trying to solve a crime. Sergeant Jones takes eyewitness reports to be very reliable, not completely reliable, but really quite reliable. And Sergeant James takes them not to be so reliable. So they've got the evidence of the eyewitness reports, and Jones is inclined to place more weight on them than James is. By attaching different weights to the evidence, they may arrive at different conclusions. Take another element that they may disagree about. The case against the suspect looks very strong. Sergeant Jones believes that the evidence is sufficient to show that Jeremy committed the theft. Sergeant James thinks that Jeremy might have been framed. The evidence is very strong, but it's strong because it was manufactured to make it look like Jeremy did the deed. So they attach different interpretations to the evidence. Having the same evidence does not by itself ensure that people will interpret it the same way or weigh it the same way. So you can get disagreements on either of these two lines, and they may be perfectly rational disagreements. We have then background information. This theft was committed at 5:35 on a Tuesday. Well, that's in the middle of rush hour. Is that a significant fact or not? Sergeant Jones thinks it is, because that means that all of the suspects have very shaky alibis. Everybody says, I was on my way home from work. They probably were on their way home from work, but who knows? His opponent says rush hour has nothing to do with it. They both agree that it was rush hour, but whether that has any bearing on how you should interpret the evidence is something that they disagree about. And it may be a significant source of disagreement. And if you think about this, if you think about things like rush hour, you realize there are vast numbers of ways of describing the relevant background facts, as like what time it was, that may or may not be significant. So there's plenty of room for reasonable disagreement here. Does it matter that it was on a Tuesday? Maybe yes, maybe no. People might disagree. We could then look at reasoning style. We said they had the same reasoning abilities. And normally philosophers tend to think, okay, that's sort of like, they do the same deduction, they do the same induction, what more do you want? But it's not that easy. So, for example, suppose Sergeant Jones is somebody who likes to reason by analogy and thinks that strong analogies convey a lot of weight. And Sergeant James disagrees. He thinks that analogies are by nature weak modes of reasoning. He can do them, but he doesn't credit them all that much. So a tight analogical argument is likely to carry more weight with Jones than with James, even though they both have the ability to do that reasoning. They have different inclinations to do it and different inclinations to attach much significance to it. So here again, we've got a ground for reasonable disagreement. Then we have another dimension along which they might disagree, which is their assessment of the importance of various factors. And now I'll switch examples once again. In this case, let's do an athletic example, because we think about it, a lot of people disagree about athletic matters. So suppose Fred and Maude disagree about why the Broncos won the Super Bowl. Fred, while acknowledging the excellence of the quarterback, says the game was won by the defense. Maude, while acknowledging the excellence of the defense, says the game was won by the quarterback. They agree about every single fact. They disagree about the importance of these facts in assigning credit for the winning of this game. Now, this is an extraordinarily common mode of disagreement, and it's one that I think is very important because it doesn't only go with things like, arguing in bars about football games. It also could happen about things that are of arguably considerably more significance, like political matters. So suppose Gareth and Dan disagree about, say, whether the UK should leave the European Union. Dan is very concerned about economic matters. Gareth is very concerned about political matters. So Gareth puts a lot of weight on things like sovereignty, people's rights in different countries, things like that. And Dan is very concerned about economic matters like trade, flow of money and goods across national borders, things like that. They can agree about what all the consequences of this possible change would be and disagree about the importance of the various factors. And again, you can see that this is a perfectly reasoned disagreement. How important is this? How important is that? One of the things we should make of it is we should become attuned to it. We should become attuned to the ways in which these disagreements can be seated in different places. So that saying we disagree doesn't yet say what we're disagreeing about. And that, I think, is important for a couple of reasons. One is just because we tend to be talking past each other sometimes. But another is because of what is possible to learn from this disagreement. If we realize that a rational disagreement among competent intellectual equals can vary along all of these dimensions, then we can learn more about the situation we're disagreeing about by studying the disagreement, finding out where we disagree, finding out what the disagreement is. We may moderate our views. It might be that when when you get the case where somebody says yes, but he might have been framed, you reassess your evidence entirely and say, yeah, maybe the evidence is looking a little bit too good here. That could be a problem. Maybe you moderate your views to something that neither one of you was initially inclined to think. So in the football case, they may come to agree that both the quarterback and the defense were absolutely critical to this win, in which case they come to conciliate on something that was neither one of their original commitments. Maybe they just suspend judgment by recognizing that the situation was vastly more complicated than they thought. So knowing how to weigh political versus economic concerns in the political question may just say, reading the paper once a week just doesn't give me enough information to make a reasonable judgment about this. All of these things are possible. And the thing that I want to recognize here is not that, talk about these things particularly as a way of coming to an agreement, but as a way of enhancing your understanding of the topic on which you're disagreeing. You know a whole lot more if you're open-minded and you investigate these issues and see on what basis could reasonable people disagree. So I'm suggesting here that if you are intellectually humble, then disagreement, rather than being something that requires resolution, may be a source of insight. It may be something valuable. But there's a benefit that actual disagreement has above and beyond what you can do just by shifting perspective, I think. And that's the following. Two benefits, I guess. One is that an intellectual equal actually disagrees with you is a reason to take that particular perspective seriously. There are an infinite number of perspectives, and some of them are frankly idiotic. And you probably shouldn't spend a whole lot of time worrying about them. But the news that somebody whose judgment you respect actually takes this one seriously gives you reason that you should do so too. So it puts intellectual weight on given perspectives. And the other is, I guess I just want to say that our imaginations are limited. So the number of perspectives any one of us can just individually shift to tends to be a bit restricted by our background experience, our upbringing, and so forth, in which case finding that others disagree with you outside of the range that you are comfortable about entertaining alternatives within is, again, a way of expanding your cognitive range. And this means that we do well to actually get more people to qualify as our intellectual equals. So if we expand the range of people we count, then we gain perspectives to take seriously. And that's an addition that's really quite important. This is a reason why when people talk about multiculturalism or talk about diversity of opinions and so forth, there's a strong intellectual argument for it because it will expand your range. It'll enable you to learn how to take seriously stuff that maybe you don't yet know how to do. And that's an advantage for you. So the suggestion then is that the intellectually humble person who takes disagreement seriously gains a lot in understanding, even if she loses something in knowledge. And it seems to me that's actually a trade-off that we should love.